Well, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really excited to be launching the next stage of our curriculum and the work that we've been doing on diversity and inclusion and improving the inclusiveness of our curriculum. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Coles. I'm Chief Executive, and you're glad to hear, won't be saying very much before handing over to our star guest, who I'm sure is the person you're all wanting to hear from. Just give you a sense of what we're going to try and do in the next hour and a half. So when I've finished talking, David is going to speak and give his keynote, and then there'll be an opportunity for question and answer straight after that. So please just obviously in the chat type questions in the question box. Anna Page, who's our Director of Strategy and Performance, is going to be moderating the Q&A and asking David some questions at the end. So what will happen is a selection of your questions will get published, so the ones that come up the most will get published, so there's no need to retype your question if it doesn't appear straight away. As questions appear, please do just sort of vote for ones that you particularly like to hear answered. After David, two colleagues who've been closely involved in the curriculum review, Christian Albert, who's Deputy Head at Whittingham Primary, and Lucy Owo, Vice Principal at Midhurst Rother, are going to talk a little bit about some of the changes we've made to the curriculum as a result of the work we've been doing on diversity and race equality over the last few months. And I hope that'll be interesting and valuable. Obviously, this work we've done on curriculum has been a really important part of a wider piece of work that I know most of you will know we're doing to try and improve race equality in the group. And you know, I think we've been very clear that we need to make a big change in the way we're representing society at large, and particularly looking to make sure that our students and pupils can see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and all colleagues of all ethnicities can see themselves reflected in the leadership of schools and the wider group. So this is, I think, really an important milestone in part of that bigger piece of work. And I'm incredibly pleased that Professor David Olusoga has agreed to speak to us today. I sort of feel like I don't really need to introduce him because he'll be well known to all of you. But of course, he is a British Nigerian historian, writer, presenter and producer, a man who has presented and produced some fantastic eye-opening work on television. He's an author of some books which I think many of us will know: Black and British: A Forgotten History, for example. His work on A House Through Time as well is, I'm sure, something that all of us know about. He's Professor of Public History at Manchester. He has an OBE awarded in the 2019 Birthday Honours List, and he's one of the people who I think, in an incredibly inspiring way, has challenged some of what's gone on in schools and challenged us to do better. I hope we're rising to the challenge that he set us in the work that we've done. And David, I'm extremely pleased to hand over to you, and thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you. Just to check everyone can hear me and this is all working. Wonderful. Well, listen, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Happy Eid Mubarak. I always say when I'm speaking to people who are educationalists and teachers that I'm not one of your tribe. I'm somebody who never really had the ambition to write children's books, but somebody who, because I write and care about Black British history and imperial history, have found myself conscripted, and rightly conscripted, into these big discussions about curricula, about inclusion in schools, about what we teach and what we don't teach, whose stories are told. and whose stories aren't told. If I may take just a couple of minutes to explain, I've written 2 children's books, both adaptations of my book that you mentioned earlier, Black and British, and I wrote those books not out of a desire to be a children's author, but out of a sort of real sense of embarrassment that I hadn't done it earlier. I published my book Black and British in 2015, and almost immediately I kept encountering parents, very often black parents, but also white parents of white kids and white parents of mixed race kids, who kept saying to me, "It's read your book, but it is 600 pages and you should write a book for children." And I'm afraid I saw myself as a more windswept and interesting figure of presenting television programs and didn't see that as something that I wanted to do. But it happened so often and so regularly that I began to think, well, they must be right. And that my reticence about being involved in the world of children's books was actually not reticence or a desire to be windswept and interested, it was self-indulgence. When I was a child, there was no Black history in school. I never encountered any history that for a second would have led me to believe the complexity, the diversity, the globalism of British history. I was taught a curriculum in which people like me were entirely absent. And the changing moment, the transformative moment in my life came when I was 16, when I bought Peter Fryer's great book, Staying Power, which had been published 2 years earlier. But if I'd been able to read a children's version of that book at 9 or 12, it would have meant an enormous amount to me. And yet, as the author of a comparable book, I have not made that same conclusion. So I find myself sort of conscripted into the world of education and thinking about curriculums and Black history out of a sense of feeling that I should have done so 5 years ago. So I'm a late arriver into your sphere and slightly embarrassed to be so. One of the questions I think we have to ask ourselves, though, in this moment and in these discussions is, why is this such a struggle? Why are we having to fight with so much energy and so much resilience to change the curriculum when it comes to race and to Black history and imperial history? Why is there such hostility and resistance to including those stories in what we teach to children at school and what is available to children to read in the books that are available to them? Why are organizations and initiatives being launched to fight for more inclusive, more expansive, and frankly, a more interesting version of British history? And why do young people, particularly young Black women in organizations like the Black Curriculum, have to spend so much of their time and their energy dedicated to fighting for the stories of their ancestors to be included in what we teach at schools? Now, you will know, many of you, the fine details far better than I do, but as things stood last year, in broad brush terms, of the 59 GCSE history modules offered by the 3 big exam boards, only 12 explicitly and overtly cover Black history, and just 5 of them cover history of Black people here in the UK. The rest explore the transatlantic slave trade or African history or African American history. And that means roughly that around only 11% of GCSE history students study modules that make any reference to what we think of as Black history in its broader sense. The absence in British schools of those histories that explore the lives of Black people in Britain and in the Empire and beyond is a reflection, however, and I think a very accurate reflection, of the general attitudes to that history outside of schools within broader British society. I think very often it's easy to convince ourselves this battle about the curriculum is unique. This myopia, this refusal to confront the broader history, to be expansive, to be inclusive, I think is quite typical of our relationship as a nation to our past. History in the UK, to me, feels like a great decaying mansion in which only a few of the rooms are inhabited, the residents huddled in a small number of rooms where they've made themselves comfortable. The rest of those rooms are neglected or in many cases kept firmly locked, their secrets and their contents never discussed. And the same can be said for many former colonial powers and for the United States in a different way and to a different extent. George Orwell, my hero, used a different metaphor. He once described Britain as being like a wealthy family maintaining a well-rehearsed conspiracy of silence as to where their money came from. this conspiracy of silence has been maintained so well for so many centuries that we're all schooled imperceptibly in playing our roles within it. We're so used to the way history is disguised that we don't see the trick being done anymore. We don't even notice the locked rooms of our history when we walk past them. Yet within those neglected spaces are critical, fascinating, enriching, if sometimes painful and challenging aspects of our national history. The histories of slavery, of empire, and of the violence that underpinned empire. Those missing histories include also the movements of migration, histories of migration and movement, of cultural absorption, and of the economic history that explains the source of some of our national wealth and where it originated from. Those histories are shared histories, and whether we call them imperial history or black history or something else, they belong to all of us. But for many of the 14% of our fellow citizens for whom those histories are their family histories, their backstories, and for the children from those communities who experience being taught a version of the British history at school that excludes those stories, those experiences are ones of exclusion. For the rest of us, it's also a missed opportunity. It's an opportunity to bind those children into the story of the nation that is their home. Because by intertwining their family histories into the national histories, it's an opportunity to place them and their identity within the story of one of the most globally connected nations there has ever been. But this lost opportunity is damaging not just for black and brown children sat in British classrooms, engaging with a curriculum that's silent about them and their families, about the empire and its legacies. It is, I would argue, equally damaging for their white classmates, because those missing histories explain why their class, why their school, why their towns look the way they do, why their friends and their football players and the musicians that they admire look the way they do, where they came from, why their names are the names that they are. In Britain, millions of people relate to our national history in a very specific way, and that explains our myopia and the reason why changing the curriculum or changing the conversation about history and how it's consumed generally is so difficult. History in Britain is very often regarded, consciously or subconsciously, as a place that we as a people go to for comfort and reassurance, a place we go to feel good about ourselves, a place that allows us to convince ourselves that we are members of a unique and exceptional nation with an exceptional history. While other nations may have done bad, our nation, unique in all of history, is supposed to have only done good, to have always been on the side of angels. History, when framed in this way, becomes a soft play area, a place of greater safety, and for it to perform that function, it is necessary that all aspects of the past that do not reinforce and substantiate that image of exceptionalism, of heroicism, are removed. There is bias in the way British history is written, the way it is delivered, but that bias is not so much between left and right, but it is optimism over pessimism. It is the focus on heroes rather than villains, on the glorious chapters rather than the inglorious chapters. We are open to the history of abolition, but not to the history of slavery. We would rather focus on the Indian railways than the Indian famines. Never a week goes by in which I am not told on social media that I am obsessed with the history of slavery and that we already know that history, that we don't need to be taught that history. And my response whenever I'm challenged on social media, whether I'm challenged in a debate or a conversation by people who say we already know this history, is a very simple question, is if we know this history, name not William Wilberforce and an abolitionist, name a slave owner, not Colston, who you heard of last year because his statue was toppled, not someone who was famous and was also a slave owner, but just a regular slave owner. Name a slave ship that's not the Amistad. Name a plantation. Most of us could not name a slave owner, a plantation, a slave ship, because we do not talk about these histories. And there are thousands of forms of myopia related to the empire. It's often said that among historians, that if you ask people in Britain to close their eyes and envisage or describe the pictures that come into their minds when you say slavery, if you ask them what the images are, they will describe huge mansions with white columns at the end of avenues of trees. They will describe fields full of cotton, and they will describe a man in a white suit who looks like the guy on the Kentucky Fried Chicken bucket. What they will describe is American cotton slavery of the 1840s or the 1850s, not British sugar slavery in Jamaica in the 1780s, proto-industrial. We are myopic, we are deluded, we are convinced that only one part of our history is worth examining and the rest must be concealed, that those rooms in the mansions that we never open must stay locked. But histories, national histories, that commit us to only looking at the positive aspects of our past, only to the epochs of glory, or only to individuals who are heroic rather than those who are, shall we say, problematic. Those forms of history are half-truths, and by their very nature, they are fragile. This is why in Britain and in other countries, the reputations of once lionized figures who made their wealth in the sale of human beings or the spreading of European power across the world, while those reputations are beginning to crumble. Yet this moment that we're living through, it is one in which those hidden histories are being revealed and encountered by millions of people. It is also one in which for some people this is enriching and empowering and exciting. For others, it is profoundly disturbing. As these histories are now emerging into popular debate and discussion, they are unfamiliar to millions of people. They are profoundly discordant with how they see not just their nations, but the identities that they have drawn from being citizens of their nations. And for some people, rather than confront the realities that British history, like the histories of all nations, is a combination of the wonderful and the terrible, many people feel the urgent need to cling on to ideas and notions of exceptionalism. And this leads them to defend the reputations of men who did appalling things and to dismiss and disavow the unheroic deeds of national heroes, rather than accept that men who did great things could also commit great crimes. This is why in the 21st century, rational, reasonable, educated people defend the reputation of slave traders and slave owners. And it is why the history school curriculum and the books our children read have become one of the front lines in our new culture wars. All of this is happening now because we are living through a quite profound moment of change and transition. I've just written a new chapter to the adult version of my book, Black and British. And I wrote that new chapter because in this time since the book was first published in 2015, two critical events have taken place that are landmarks in the history that book is attempting to express. The first, depressingly, is the Windrush scandal. But the second is the events of last summer, the events of Black Lives Matter, the events that are still reverberating around the world. The past 12 months have been 12 months of impossibilities made possible. They have been a period like no other. When it comes to race, I can't help thinking about a quote that is attributed to Lenin. And like many of the best quotes, we're not really sure whether Lenin actually said it. It's attributed to him. But what Lenin said, or was supposed to have said, is something along these lines. There are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. That's the story of the past 12 months. It is as if our collective capacity to engage with these issues of race and diversity and inclusion, that all of this was suddenly accelerated, like the fast forward button was pressed. And one way to remind ourselves about how remarkable these past 12 months were is to think about where we were about a year ago today. It is soon the anniversary of the murder and we can now call it a murder officially, of George Floyd. Think about where you were this time last year in the early weeks of May, and imagine how much progress you might have imagined would have been possible, how many discussions and debates and initiatives might be launched, how many organizations would examine their cultures, their practices, their histories, their connections to slavery, to empire. And then think about what's actually happened. Think about what could have been reasonably expected, and then think about where we have got to and how much has happened. Speaking for myself, if somebody had told me in early May last year that during the summer, half of the books in the Sunday Times bestseller list would be books on race and Black history, I would not for a moment have believed them. If someone had told me that millions of young people in countries right across the world and here in Britain would use their social media networks to organize themselves and their friends to take to the streets in thousands and thousands of marches and demonstrations, all of them in the name of anti-racism, I would have said that was unlikely at best. If I had been told this time last year that the statue of Edward Colston that stood in the centre of Bristol, the city I'm talking to you from today, that statue would be toppled, again, I would have dismissed the idea as naive. The events, the conversations, the discussions, the initiatives launched by companies, corporations, schools, university, charities in 2020 and early 2021 to examine their practices and their cultures, to commit in many cases to anti-racist action. None of that was predicted, and none of it was predictable this time last year. Now, what the British tabloids said took place last year was that global radicals gathered under the banner of Black Lives Matter set about rewriting British history. And that charge of rewriting British history is knowingly and deliberately preposterous, as the job of historians is to write history and rewrite history as new evidence and new interpretations come to hand. However, that charge, knowingly disingenuous, as I say, is a way of denying the distortions of our history that have always taken place and that have been particularly prevalent when it comes to issues around Black history and empire over the past centuries. That idea of rewriting history is a way of framing historians, activists, and young people who are interested in changing the curriculum as enemies of the people. It deliberately sets Black history and imperial history in opposition and as a threat to British history, mainstream British history, for want of a better word. And it suggests that the recognition and the acknowledgement and the incorporation of the latter, of the former, is a threat to the latter. What really happened in 2020 was not that history was rewritten, but that millions of people came to understand, in many cases for the first time, that British history had already been rewritten. People who bought those books in the summer of 2020 and put them on the Sunday Times bestseller list came to appreciate that for centuries we've been engaged in a process of whitewashing the past. It was a process that edited out those difficult chapters, a process that created an alternative version of our past, one in which the centuries of slavery and imperialism are of little importance and barely mentioned, one in which the past communities of Black Georgians, Black Tudors, Black Victorians were not worthy of mention, one in which empire was no longer at the centre of Britain's story, but a marginal sidebar. British history was rewritten, but not in the summer of 2020. It was rewritten decades ago, centuries ago, by those who wanted those aspects of the history that did not fit, that did not allow us to see history as a place of greater safety, a place that substantiated our exceptionist delusion about ourselves and our nation. It was rewritten by them who wanted us to remember abolition but to forget slavery, who wanted us to remember the abolitionists but not the enslaved people who fought for their own freedom with words and petitions when given the chance, with swords and muskets when they were given no other option. It was rewritten by men who wanted us to remember Edward Colston as a philanthropist but not as a slave trader, who wanted us to celebrate Hans Sloane as the collector he undoubtedly was, the man whose collection became the nucleus for our national museum, the British Museum, but who wanted us to ignore the fact that much of the wealth that built that collection came from his wife's plantations in Jamaica and the murderous exploitation, commoditization of the black people who lived there. To be in Britain at the moment like this is like being in a room in which two different discordant pieces of music are playing on the same stereo. Two versions of our past that we are told are at odds with one another are being discussed loudly in both corners of the room. The fundamental assertion underpinning the culture war that is complicating and muddying the waters around the understandable, the necessary, the desirable need to incorporate the stories of everybody in this country into our curriculum. The fundamental battle line behind that is that Black history is a threat to other people's histories. If accepted and embraced and written into the curriculum, that our story somehow eclipses and diminishes the histories of poor white people. But the optimism of this moment comes from knowing that that position is false. Black British history is not a threat to British history for the very simple reason that it is British history. Without it, any view of ourselves, who we have been, where we have come from, can only be incomplete. And even if there were no black and brown minority populations living in Britain, even if our nation was not 14% ethnic minorities, this history would still be necessary, because without it, without the stories of trade and empire and slavery, none of British history of the past 500 years can be properly and wholeheartedly and fully understood. This is not a case of your history versus our history. It is a history only, of story only, of our history. There is only British history, and those who claim otherwise do so either out of ignorance or, increasingly, political electoral strategizing. Yet that view is deeply embedded in anyone, including teachers, educationalists, historians, and journalists who seek to challenge it, will have to confront and challenge that dangerous dichotomy. I present a series on BBC Two called A House Through Time, and over 4 series, we have explored the lives of people who lived in 4 houses in 4 British cities. That has inevitably involved an enormous range of stories, an enormous range of human experiences. And throughout those 4 series, 3 of them broadcast, 1 yet to be broadcast, we've never had a complaint about any subject that we have ever encountered and ever told, except one. We have talked about domestic violence, child abuse. We've talked about child mortality. We've talked about HIV. We have experienced murder. We have explored the full range from light to dark of the human experience of the hundreds of people who lived in those houses that we have explored. Only one subject has ever been the focus of complaint by reviewers or by people who have written into the BBC to complain, and that one subject was when the house in Bristol had been built by slave traders. All of those subjects, war, violence, domestic violence, child mortality, child abuse, all of those were accepted by the audience, not as a challenge to them, but as merely an acceptable aspect of British history worthy of discussion. Only slavery was deemed to be beyond the pale. That experience, that singling out of these histories is fundamentally connected to the need for history to be comforting in a very specific way. History can be challenging in terms of the horrors that it reveals, only so long as it does not suggest that Britain is like every other nation that has ever existed. It's done some good things and done some bad things. Any history, no matter how dark or challenging, so long as it doesn't clash with our notion of exceptionalism. The other source of optimism to be drawn from the moment that we're living through is that this is not a moment of political change, despite the fact that it is being harnessed for political reasons, despite the culture wars. This is a moment that can only be understood as a generational transition. The historic meaning of the moment we're in is not yet fully understood, yet one of the ways which I think we can see what it means, and we can make it visible, is to think about the crowds who took to the streets in the marches and demonstrations of 2020 and compare them to previous moments. If you go back and watch the film and photography of the civil rights movement in the America of the 1960s, this is what you will see. You will see marches and demonstrations in which Black people took to the streets in the struggle for racial justice. Look at the photographs of those people campaigning, and what you will see is the people marching and demonstrating for social justice are Black people. Likewise, look at the pictures of the demonstrations by Black people in Britain in the 1980s, like the famous New Cross March of 1981. Again, what you will see is Black people marching for racial justice and Black equality. Then look at the marches and demonstrations of 2020. What you will see is people of every race and every background, Black people, brown people, white people, together in allyship, making demands for anti-racist action, demands that our nation stop hiding behind comparisons with America or delusions of exceptionalism, demanding that our nation confront the dark and inglorious chapters of our past, as well as celebrate the remarkable ones. The demonstrators of 2020 were of all races and ethnicities. What unites them is not race, but youth. We are witnessing a generational shift in consciousness brought about by the emergence of a new generation that found its voice and found its platform in the summer of 2020. In an interview in June last year, a veteran of those earlier struggles in the 60s and 70s, the legendary African-American activist Angela Davis described this moment that we are living through as one in which, quote, we are finally witnessing the consequences of decades and centuries of attempting to expel racism from our societies. The emergence of this global anti-racist movement, Angela Davis argued, has created a moment of possibility. What we are offered, she said, is the possibility of reimagining and recreating the future. We are at quite incredible crossroads. We're at a moment of enormous generational change. And it is for that reason that we are also at a moment of great hostility and division. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very, very much. I think that was incredibly inspiring and optimistic, whilst also being extremely challenging. And the message that history is not a soft play area, I think, will stay with me for a very long time. We've got quite a few questions that have come in, so I'm now handing over to Anna to ask you, David, some questions. Anna.
Thank you, John, and thank you, David. Yeah, that was really excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to try and group these a bit by theme, and I suspect more will come in as we're talking. So I'll try and pick up others as we go. I guess I just wanted to start by picking up on that point of the kind of history as a soft play area. Do you think, is there something kind of particularly unique in the way that we view our history in Britain, or is that something that is shared with other countries?
I think it's not unique, and Britain actually is not the nation. Let's take the story, the issue of empire. Britain is not. Sorry, have I lost you there?
No, we can hear you.
Still.
Yeah.
My computer did something strange. Britain is not the nation with the most rosy image of its imperial past. That's actually, and it pains me to say this, I went to university in Leiden, it's actually the Dutch. I love Holland so much, I find it very difficult to think bad things about the Dutch. They're also, so will all been so lovely to me. Holland is the country with the most deluded sense of its empire. It's the country that believes its empire did the most good. It's the country that has the strongest sense that its empire should be brought back. We are number 2 in that unfortunate league table. We're not unique, but not all countries need their history to perform this function. The obvious example, and for here I have to, for reasons of the existence of the Daily Mail, I have to say this is a comparison between attitudes towards histories, not national histories, is Germany. Germany has a very different relationship with its history, though I have to say only to its history of the 12 years between 1933 and 45. Germany has an equally deluded understanding of its imperial history in Africa. But Germany's relationship with its past is to see it as a series of cautionary tales. Germans look at history, and they look at the memorialization of history as a place you go to learn hard truths and to confront difficult realities, not always to feel good about yourself. Germans tend to go and look at their culture, and they have very good reason to go and look at their culture as a place to feel a sense of exceptionalism. They look at their history in a much harder and more analytical way. But what's fascinating is that did not begin in 1945. That came out of the huge clash that took place in Germany between the generations who had been through the war and their children. And in the 1960s, when their children came of age, there was an incredible generational schism in Germany when the young generation began to ask their teachers, their employers, their parents what they had done in the war and whether they had resisted or whether they had been complicit. And when they discovered the ways in which people who had been part of the Third Reich had been rehabilitated and put into positions of power and influence in politics, in local government, in business, they were appalled. And what came about was the modern Germany that we know, that is a country determined to look at the harsh truths of its history. If you look at the Germany of the late 40s and the 1950s, that is a Germany that sees itself as the greatest victim of the Second World War. That is a country where there was demonstrations against the prosecution of war criminals. That is a country where the complaints of Russia and Poland and the countries that have been occupied, never mind the victims of the Holocaust, were always weighed in balance against the German death toll. Now, Germany doesn't do that anymore, not because of the lessons of the Second World War, but because young people in Germany of a younger generation forced the country into a quite incredible moment of reckoning. Now, that was an deeply painful experience for Germany. And there's a very good book called Learning from the Germans by Susan Neumann that discusses it. But I mean, there were confrontations over the dining room table within families. Awful questions asked, huge divisions, families broken up, relationships destroyed, teachers who lost respect. It was a deeply divisive moment. Now, I hope what we need to go through is not as divisive as that. But that's how Germany became the most remarkable nation when it comes to confronting that aspect of its history, because of a generational schism. And I raise it for obvious reasons, because I do think that's what's happening. What I learn from my students at Manchester and from young people who come to talks I give back when I was allowed out the house was they have a completely different view to these attitudes to my generation and the generation older. They are absolutely repelled by racism, and they see it as unquestioningly, in a way that I find kind of breathtaking in its ambition and its forthrightness. They see it as obviously, inevitably, unquestionably, their generational duty to try to weed racism completely out of their society. Now, if I think back to when I was their age, I think I might have hoped things would get better. I might have imagined that racism would become less prevalent. I never had the audacity to imagine that racism could be driven out of a society. Now, maybe I'm right and they're wrong. Maybe cynics win and youthful optimism loses. But the fact that they have that belief is in itself an incredible achievement, an incredibly powerful force, which is one of the reasons I think the culture war against them is being waged so ruthlessly, and they are being so disparaged, because what they believe is so profoundly different to the older generations, and they are so profoundly committed to those beliefs. Sorry, a long answer. I've never mastered the art of the short answer. I warned your colleagues yesterday. Sorry.
That's absolutely fine. I'm sure you'll, in doing that, answer lots of the questions that people have asked, and we'll kind of play around with them a bit. I guess on that, sort of a number of colleagues have I think touched on in their questions the fact that in designing and devising a curriculum we have to make choices. And because of the fact that the time that we have to teach is limited, what would you, sort of starting with, in thinking about those choices, what would you, which aspect of Black British history do you think is most neglected within our current kind of standard history curriculum?
Well, I think for very understandable reasons, the forms of Black history that tend to be taught in schools are really useful, but they have a limitation. And I need to, God, this is another long answer. I'll pre-warn you, another long answer. I think we need to go back to the way Black history developed in this country. It developed from historians in the 60s and 70s, for Florence Shylon, Peter Fryer in the 80s, Jim Walvin in the 60s, who were doing what was effectively historical recovery. They were beginning with a blank page. Jim Walvin, Professor Jim Walvin of the University of York, a friend of mine, when he began and wrote his PhD, which became the book Black and White, the Negro in British History, he literally wrote to every county archivist in Britain and said, "You got any black people?" I mean, so little was known. There was a few paragraphs in books on the 18th century. There were fragmented bits of biography. There were people we knew because they were in portraits, and that was it. So they were involved in this work of historical salvage. They dragged these fragments of history out of the archives and tried to assemble this jigsaw piece. And that was an incredible work. And I'm able to do what I do because of their work. And I those of them which are still with us, I've made them very much aware of my admiration for their work. But what happened in the 80s was that we did something I think extremely wise in this country. We imported, was an American import. Most American imports have been less wise than this one. We imported Black History Week, which began life in America in the 1920s as Negro History Week. We brought it here as Black History Month. We brought not just the idea, we brought the template of American history. And that's where I think there was a problem. The template of American history is based on a truism about America, which is largely a truism, which is you can tell the story of African American history through the stories of African Americans within the continental United States. Obviously, there are African Americans, there's experiences in Liberia, there's experiences of African Americans who travel, there's experiences of African Americans who are caught within the transatlantic travel between Britain and America when it's an American colony. But it is largely true that you can tell African American history through American history. That's not true of Black British history. And the template doesn't work. The template doesn't work because Black British history by its nature is global and by its nature is imperial. And it also doesn't work because we can't tell this history entirely biographically, because despite the work of those early historians creating or exhuming this pantheon of Black British figures from the archives, presenting them to us in their groundbreaking books, they don't tell the full history. There are gaps where we just don't have a Mary Prince or an Uludo Equiano or a Dido Bell. We haven't got someone in that part of history around which to build a history, because biography cannot always do the job of history. It can't do economics, and it can't do histories in which we're talking about forces rather than individuals. So what we have done is we've taken this rather heavily biographicized history with an American template, and we brought it into our schools and into our books, into television programs. And the problem with that is it leaves those gaps. So the parts of history which I think we most desperately need to tell are those that can't be told through biography. The great example that I always use is the history of the Industrial Revolution. Now, we don't have an individual to explain this, but the fundamental Black history nature of the Industrial Revolution is that Britain's #1 export in the middle of the 19th century is cotton-produced yarn and clothing. The 4,500 mills of Lancashire that employed directly or indirectly 1 in 5 people, according to The Economist in the early 1860s. All of that is predicated, or largely predicated, on the #1 source of the raw material, which was the Deep South of the United States. Now, you can't tell an honest, wholehearted, comprehensive history of the Industrial Revolution, the absolute fundamental cornerstone of the history I was taught in school in Newcastle and Gateshead, as you can imagine. I mean, it's the only part of British history where the North's richer than the South. It's the part when our cities were built. We are never going it's never going to be anything other than central to what children need to learn in their history growing up in the North or the Midlands, because it is the most dynamic, exciting part of our history. You can't understand that history without the Black component of it, but that component didn't take place in Britain, and it can't be biographized. So through that lens of Black British history that we inherited, it is invisible, and yet that is fundamental. Take a mill in Lancashire. The cotton is coming from Mobile, Alabama, or Savannah, Georgia, or from New Orleans, Louisiana. It's produced in the Cotton Kingdom, the Mississippi Valley, for the most part. Some comes from the Caribbean, some comes from Egypt. Most of it the vast majority comes from the Deep South. Take the machinery. The machinery is being lubricated with palm oil, which comes from West Africa, which is one of the motivations for deeper British involvement in the country my ancestors come from, Jamaica, was to get access to palm oil, the great machine lubricant. That mill outside of Burnley or Bradford or Manchester is a global place. And the material it produces is going all over the world. All of that is invisible to the lens of Black British history that I was taught. So I was taught every detail about the cotton mills of Lancashire, apart from that one detail, where the cotton came from. And it is these moments when we would encounter Black people, not as individuals and biographies, but as masses people, but people who are nameless and faceless, but whose stories we can tell. Those linkages between what we might think of as Black history and what we've come to be got used to as British history, those linkages have been broken, sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately. And to me, that's the priority. We can't tell these broad strokes of British history without confronting these histories. You can't tell the story of the 19th century without cotton, the same as you couldn't tell it without coal. You can't tell the story of the 18th century without the Atlantic slave trade. And yet we do. We attempt to tell this fragile half-truth of a history.
Thank you. Yeah, that certainly picks up on what a lot of colleagues have been asking about, the kind of the insufficiency of our approach focusing solely on the slave trade, which came across very clearly in what you said in your talk. To what extent should we also be trying to teach histories that are representative of the student body, and I guess by that, but sort of picking up on the histories of countries like Bangladesh, like Kurdistan, like the kind of from those countries where those students and or their families may have come to this country from.
I think it's sort of enormously including and positive for children to see their stories being told. My daughter is 6 and she's at school, and the kids from different parts of the world have done little show and tells about their country, and my daughter has come back enthused and determined to visit these countries that she'd not really heard of. And you can see those kids glowing with pride about being able to talk about their nations, to bring in the flag, to talk about the food. What I felt when my daughter came back was, God, it would have been wonderful to have been asked about Nigeria as a child who'd got off a plane. But I was a kid in the 70s. It was utterly unimaginable. So through my experiences and my daughter's experiences, I've seen how powerfully embracing it is, and it's made me more aware of how I was written out of the histories and the stories and the school as I was attending it. But I think there's that only works if those children and their families are willing to do it and they want to do it. But I think that there are histories which are unavoidable. I don't think, again, as you can tell the story of Britain without the story of India, it doesn't make sense. And as I said in my talk, this will be important, even if, for some historical reason unimaginable, Britain had no non-white community, which of course it has done consistently since at least the 17th century. It would still be necessary. Those white children in an all-white imaginary Britain in a parallel universe would still be being taught an anemic, half-truth version of their past if we weren't telling these stories. It sounds sort of Boy Scoutish and po-faced, but I mean, there is just an honesty in history without omissions. There is, which is necessary beyond the fact that it would have made a child like me feel more wanted and more irrespective of the student body. This authenticity and truthfulness in the way we tell British history.
Thank you. And just finally on this the sort of question of choices, is there anything you could say to help our schools and help our teachers with making those choices and how they do that in a way? You know, there is obviously more that we could. There's always more that we could do. I
mean, to me, I mean, I've as you said, this will not be a long answer, I promise. One of the things that made me really aware of the problem we have about Black British history was many years ago. I was in a school in Bristol. I'm talking to you from Bristol. And it was Black History Month, and they had done a wall chart, and it had Rosa Parks and the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott in it. But the teacher and the children had never heard of the Bristol bus boycott. Mm. Now, this school was a mile away from where Roy Hackett and Paul Stevenson, who were still alive, who led that boycott, where they were living. They'd never been into the school. The teachers had never heard of them. They'd never heard of the boycott. That sort of importation of American content along with an American format that's a kind of extreme example of it. But there are kind of two things. There are voices that are documentary and voices that are living. When I've seen veterans of the Windrush generation in schools giving talks, it's wonderful. It's just fantastic, describing their experiences of getting off a boat and seeing snow for the first time, if they were crazy enough to arrive in winter. I've seen kids enthralled by that. I've given a lesson about the advertisements, the hue and cry advertisements, 900 of which have now been found by historians for the recapture of escaped enslaved people in Britain. You can go to a class in Bristol and you can show the children an advertisement for the recapture of a child in their city, in streets that they know. And the effect is they are mesmerized and horrified and enthralled. And it is the power of individual narrative, the power of diaries. And I think the authenticity comes from those voices. We are so blessed, and it's such a chance happening that we have voices like Ignatius Sancho and Ulude Equiano and fragments of Mary Prince, that we have Frederick Douglass's voices in Britain. We have people who are with us and people who are long gone, whose voices are just alive with authenticity. And I think we need to incorporate those voices and those narratives wherever we can. And I know some of the language is difficult and challenging for children, but I have seen it done, really well. I mean, I should say as a caveat, I'm half my family are teachers, and I'm very cautious about telling teachers how to do their job because it's so difficult, and I really understand the pressures that you're under. But what I see in my observations, talking to teachers, especially teachers who come to talks that I give, is I see people not allowing limitations of curriculum to stand in the way. I see teachers going out and buying books and making materials. I'm constantly on social media seeing people, teachers sending me exhibits of the work that they've done that includes fragments from my books. I see a sort of in the very best tradition of British history, a sort of make do and mend, slightly World War, don't panic and carry on attitude amongst teachers who, irrespective of the curriculum, want to present a history that's relevant to the children who sit in their classrooms. And it's far beyond the call of duty. And again, one of the reasons that I, to my great surprise, find myself writing history books is because it wasn't just parents, it was teachers who sort of shamed me into action. I was speaking to a teacher a few years ago who said, we're having to rely on African American teaching materials because no one's written the British ones. Everyone's got a responsibility in this. Publishers, education publishers and authors. All of us have a responsibility, but that responsibility is to support the teachers who are doing it on the front line themselves.
And that is a really nice segue into a couple of questions about what advice you would give to teachers who are keen to teach more about the topics that you've been talking about, but who really feel that they need to improve their own subject knowledge of the areas first. Where should they?
I'm not on top of. I remember a few years ago I was at Hay on Wye, the book festival, and I've been there for many years. I used to go there as a journalist before I started writing myself. I worked in the BBC Arts department, and it's a place you went to talk to writers to try to get them to make programs. And I don't think I'd ever not been the only Black British person there. There were often writers from India or Africa, but there was never Black British people. I think 3 years ago I was in the green room with Afua Hirsch and Akala because we'd all written books. And it was just, it was like we were kind of having our own little mini Harlem Renaissance. We were all astonished at the presence of the others, and it felt like a sort of shift. And then we've had last year. One of the industries that was most shocked into action, that looked at them in the mirror, I think most honestly and frankly, and saw its reflection, was the publishing industry. And there was all sorts of change. There's now a guild of black writers to try to keep up the pressure on the publishing industry. And I think there was a real shift in the amount of books, the writers who are being invested in, the number of books that are in the pipeline about Black British history. So I think that the publishing industry, very belatedly, a bit like Waterloo, is coming, just in the nick of time to help teachers. But I think it's clearly been really difficult. I mean, I can see that from the ways in which teachers are spending their weekends patching together and piecing together from books like my own and Miranda Kaufman's work and Akala's work, piecing things together, because it hasn't been done. I did a lesson plan with my sister, who is a Doctor of Education at Sheffield University, for the curriculum about the Lascars, the Indian seamen, earlier this year, and it was because again, I just talk to teachers and they go, "Where are the lesson plans?" So I hear you. I think the publishing industry hears you, but my God, we should have done this 10, 15, 20 years ago. There should be no shortage of resources, because there's been no shortage of determination among teachers. To do this, I was talking to a teacher, a woman who taught in a school in London in the 1980s, who was telling me she remembered Staying Power, the book I read at 16, being published, and making lessons plans from it. I published Black and British in 2015. It was a homage to Staying Power, and between 1984 and 2015 there had not been another big book on Black British history published. That's appalling. And if it is another 30 years, which I'm sure it won't be, between another encyclopedic book on Black British history being published, then nothing's got better. But I don't think it will be, because I think, again, for that sort of the optimism of 2020, it is different. Something has happened. We'd be crazy to be convinced that that's the end of the story and we've reached some El Dorado. But I think there are qualitative differences between what happened in 2020 and other moments that felt like moments of awakening on these issues of race, diversity and inclusion. And
picking up on the point that you made when you were talking and have made in response to some of the questions, that some of these topics and these issues are difficult issues to address by their nature, by not being seduced into the soft play area, as it were. Do you have any advice for teachers who might themselves feel nervous about kind of how they address those sensitive topics with children, both Black British children and white British children? Yeah,
well, I'm always amazed at how. It was really interesting working with colleagues at Macmillan to write the children's version of Black and British. I presumed you could tell them nothing, and my hand was very firmly held through that process to try to learn how to do this very different form of writing. And I've come away, and particularly the reactions of parents and children, thinking that I was enormously overprotective of children, that they are far more capable to confront and deal with difficult ideas than I had presumed. But I guess the other thing I would say is I think some of what happened in this country is that we wanted to whitewash these painful parts of our past. So we hid them, we brushed them under the carpet, we locked them in the rooms of the past that we never go into. And because we were so unfrightened of all of it and so uncomfortable with all of it, we never really noticed that some of it's really quite life affirming and positive. I mean, the story I always tell is the story of Pablo Fanki, who was the great Black British Victorian circus entrepreneur He was a great impresario. He performed for Queen Victoria. His real name was William Darby, and he was from Norwich, and he decided being called William Darby from Norwich was not going to cut it in the circus industry, so he invented the stage persona, Pablo Fanchi. He performed on the back of horses and on trapeze. His son, as a very young age, was one of the greatest trapeze artists of the 19th century. And one of the reasons we know about him is because of an incredibly chance happening, which is that in 1967, the Beatles were in Kent, in Sevenoaks. John Lennon got bored of making the very weird video to Strawberry Fields. He went to an antique shop and he bought a bill poster for a Victorian circus, and that circus was Pablo Fanchi's circus. And from it, he almost word for word produced the song For the Benefit of Mr. Kite on Sgt. Pepper, the greatest album of all time. And that album contains the song Pablo Fanchi's Fair. Now, I don't think John Lennon or Paul McCartney knew for a second this was a black circus performer. But you think about Pablo Fanchi, he was one of the greatest circus performers of his age, one of the most famous men in the world of entertainment of his time. He wasn't just a performer, he ran a circus. He performed for Queen Victoria. He's in a Beatles song. How could you be more central to British history than to have performed the Queen Victoria and be on Sgt. Pepper's? And yet we've forgotten about him. We've forgotten about the people who are the sort of the wonderful life-affirming stories, as well as talking about Mary Prince and their experiences of enslavement. Or there's someone like Henry Box Brown, who escaped from slavery and whose story involves slavery in America, but also this incredible abolitionist story where he becomes a campaigner, a performative abolitionist who performed his escape. He posted himself from slavery in Virginia to Philadelphia in a mailbox, and he spent half the 1850s in Britain traveling around with his box. He reposted himself, I think, from Leeds to Bradford in Britain as part of his abolitionist campaigning. There are wonderful stories here, which I think can help children, prepare them for the darker side. So I think children are tougher than I thought, and the story there's more light than just shade to this story than many people imagine.
Thank you. And just another theme that has been picked up in questions is I guess the kind of link between learning about the past and using the past to think about the present. And therefore, to the extent to which you think that schools should, or how might schools better address current examples of colonialism and slavery, indeed, and the link between the two of learning about the past and thinking about the present?
Well, I mean, I fear that someone who works in television is uniquely badly placed to do that, because one of the things I notice about my industry is you can talk about the past, but you can't make linkages to the present. So I think television is comfortable about making programs about imperialism, talking about neo-colonialism or the legacy of colonialism, or in some ways maybe arguably the myth of decolonization is something people find much, much harder. We've made programs about countries that are at war, about the wars that were fought in the 19th century, rather than the wars that are currently taking place there. Never mind the linkages between those conflicts and the past. I think another feature of British history, which I think is maybe even more intractable, is the idea that the past is over, that the past is the past, and that it is politicizing history to talk about the way it shapes the present, rather than that is the whole point of history, is to learn from the way in which it shapes the present. So I think the challenge there is a challenge that our entire society, not just teachers, face, which is another element of history that is discordant with the way that we like to understand British history. In the exceptionalist view of British history, the past is all over, and all to be learned from it is that we are the inheritors of it, and we imbibe the characteristics and the noble qualities of our ancestors, and that we can't trust foreigners. It's not very applied to the present. You know, we don't talk very much about the way in which the Industrial Revolution drove us into cities and made us the most urbanized country in Europe. We don't talk very much about how the factory system created the class, the idea of the precarious underclass. Whether it's empire or whether it's class, whether it's race, we're not very good at, and we're not very comfortable with seeing history as a guide to the present. So I think we all face that problems, and I think it's particularly difficult in classrooms with parents who might be uncomfortable with that, and with other observers and interest and stakeholders who might be comfortable about talking about slavery in the 1850s in America, but not comfortable about talking about decolonization and the role of British corporations in Africa today.
So yeah, that's something for us all to keep working on then.
I think as a country, and I think it's particularly different for teachers, but I think that's a particular feature of the British approach to history and the forms of myopia that it incubates. Yeah,
thank you. And then I'm conscious. I think we have probably another sort of 5 minutes or so of your time. I think. So I'll just try and pick up a couple of other themes. One other one is we've obviously rightly been talking a lot about history, but a number of colleagues sort of picking up on the role of other subjects of diverse writing in English, of PSHE as a way of kind of tackling some of these themes, perhaps in a sort of more contemporary way, and indeed of kind of outside the curriculum of kind of co-curricular, of trips, of kind of ways of exposing children to the ideas and to the topics that you've talked about. I just wondered if you wanted to kind of extend the challenge beyond history into those other areas.
I'm afraid there's very little about me that's beyond history. I'm quite myopic. I've spent my entire life writing history books, making history programs, and talking about history in talks. I have kind of one experience of this, which is that a friend of mine is a teacher. He got kids in his class to read Sam Sevlin's book, The Lonely Londoners, about Black and Caribbean migrants to Britain in the 1950s. And I mean, I love that book, and it's a wonderful book, but he was astonished. These were kids in London, that these kids could imagine a London that was very different, and they could imagine what it was like to be a guy from Trinidad just off a boat trying to build a life within that city. And I'm never ceased to be astonished by the power of literature. But it was so wonderful to hear my friend talk about the power that this book had with young people. And, I think we often go straight to the African American canon, and I think there are neglected gems within Black British writing, which I think are sort of wonderfully powerful. And it's, when I read A Lonely Londoner, I think about the descriptions of Waterloo Station, and the fact that these 15-year-olds were as well, I think is fantastic.
Thank you. And then just a couple of other things, on that colleagues have picked up on. You obviously talked about statues and talked about kind of what we've discovered, I guess, or kind of relearnt over the last year about the links between stately homes and slavery and individuals and the slave trade. To what extent should we be using those examples and learning from them versus, I guess, in this case of statues, toppling them?
Well, I mean, I think I've made, because I've got a big mouth and a newspaper column, I think I've made my views clear on statues. I mean, to summarize those views, I think all statues need to be taken as individual examples. I think sometimes the answer is removal. I think sometimes it's contextualization. But holding the line, which is what the government wants to do, and pretending that once a history has been cast into stone, or cut into stone or cast into marble, that's the end of it, and that statues represent history, that is a falsehood. It's a deliberate falsehood, and it's a politically motivated falsehood. And I think these debates about statues, underpinning them, deconstructing them, I think it's one of the most interesting things that that you could teach to children. And one of the reasons I was so pleased that it was Colston, is not just I live in Bristol, is because it's a perfect example of the nonsense that statues represent history. Colston died in 1721. The statue was erected in 1895. We have no idea what Colston looked like. It's a late Victorian public artist's imagination of what an early Georgian merchant might have looked like. The statue plaque mentioned his philanthropy. It was silent on his slave trading. It was put up for entirely historical reasons, but there to do with the historical, the history of the 1890s and the demands of Bristol's merchant elite to dominate the city by creating a heroic figure from among their ranks. It's fantastic. It shows exactly the point that I keep making, which is why I love it so much, is the statues aren't history. What they are is a great way of understanding the past, but not on the terms dictated by the people who erected those statues, who are almost always men, almost always rich, and almost always have an ulterior motive. This country's littered and studded with statues, have amazing backstories. The statue of Oliver Cromwell outside Parliament was the story. You could write a novel about the battle over whether that statue should be put up. It tore the Victorian elite apart. It's an amazing story. So I think statues deconstructing the histories behind their erection rather than the histories that they pretend to portray is an immensely fruitful arena, because those stories show the history of history. They show how history has been manipulated by the elite for their interests and how heroes have been created for a function, not just to honour men who are deemed to be great.
Great, thank you. And very quickly and finally, a question about what was your favourite or most memorable history lesson when you were at school, and why was that?
Well, I was brought up in the Northeast, as I said, and it's not my favourite, but I think it's the most telling about the nature of my schooling. We were taught for weeks about the mining industry in the Northeast, about the long series of mining disasters, of roofs that caved in and mines under the sea that flooded. And then the next week we were told, guess what, kids, we're going to a mine in a place called Beamish. So after telling us about all of these disasters, our teachers, in a sort of Dickensian act of cruelty, then made us go into a mine at Beamish heritage site. I would like to think teachers might invert those two experiences these days. So it was. I constantly think about that. As I can laugh about it now. We were terrified. So that's how not to teach history.
That's a good cautionary tale on which to end. Thank you very much, David, for such expansive and excellent answers, and for engaging with people's questions so thoughtfully, and for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you for all the work that you're doing and the debates and conversations and challenges that you're making.
Back to me, I think, just briefly. And could I add my thanks, David? That was absolutely brilliant. And I thought your answers were incredibly rich and wise and full of insight. And I'm sure that all of us would love to hear more from you, and could keep this conversation going for a very long time. But thank you so much for your time and that brilliant speech and Q&A. To those of you watching on recorded version of this, I should just say I'm really sorry that the timing of this is not brilliant, and doing this on Eid is not the cleverest thing that we've ever done. But I hope you can see why we felt that, having managed to capture a bit of David's time, we felt it was the right thing to go ahead. And I hope that some of the energy and challenge and insight that David's given us has really come across on the video version, as it certainly has in the live version. And Eid Mubarak to all of you as well. So I'm now going to hand over to Christian and Lucy, as previously advertised, who are going to say a word or two about changes we've been making to the curriculum and some of the new things that you'll see coming through and being made available. And I hope supporting all of you with your teaching and planning over the coming weeks and months. And I'm not sure who I'm handing over to first. Is it Christian or is it Lucy? It's Lucy. Oh, sorry, Lucy, over to you.
No problem. Thank you very much, John. So just a little bit about my experience. So I was privileged to work on this initiative, both as a member of the steering group and also part of the curriculum leads team, where we explored ideas on what success would look like across all spectrum of the curriculum. The review created a great opportunity to reflect on our curriculum across the group, both primary and secondary. And on reflecting on the process for myself, it was really exciting to have the opportunity to be part of something that will really make massive difference to the lived experiences of ethnic minority students under our care, and on a wider level affect positive change in school communities across United Learning. Now, this was really important for me because of my experience of the education system, our education system in the 80s and 90s, I think in the way that David described earlier. Also, as the mother of a now young adult who I remember on occasions would come back from school really upset and really quite frustrated at moments that made her feel like she didn't quite belong. And so through this process for me, what was really, really powerful was seeing everybody engaged in an open, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable but necessary dialogue around the changes that we need to see happen going forward. And alongside rethinking the curriculum, we also reflected on the importance of creating a space and the time for teachers to ask questions, to learn from each other, and to then feel empowered in their knowledge to engage students with confidence. And so in terms of what this then means for us at MRC, I think for us, the first step is to inquire rather than assume. And what I mean by that is, despite the positive indications from student surveys over the past few years, actually to talk to ethnic minority students and capture their lived experiences. And as a school, we actually began this work this half term. And the information that we gleaned will be useful and will inform our assembly, tutor time, enrichment program going forward. We also, as part of this work, ensure that ethnic minority perspective is included in our choice of books for our whole school reading program. I will just add here that we did in fact conduct the same student voice panel with other minority groups such as the LGBTQ community in recognition of the wider work that we need to do beyond just ethnic minority representation. And so just going on from that, I've had a number of conversations with Stuart Edwards, my principal, and we're working on also the importance of addressing language as part of the shift in culture. So words like acceptance instead of tolerance, for example. And so within our subject curriculum, finally, we tend to dedicate, as I'm sure we all do, summer to adapting schemes of work and designing those schemes of work for the next academic year. And one of the key questions that we're going to be asking our leaders around their curriculum design going forward is exactly how is it that we're ensuring that we're reflecting but normalizing diversity in every subject. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Christian now.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Christian Albert. I'm Deputy Head Teacher at Whittingham Primary Academy, a school in Walthamstow, and today we'll be just discussing some of the concrete examples that the primary diversity curriculum has been now established, and we'll be looking at some of the examples that have been created or adapted. And I'll also be talking a little bit about how, as a deputy head, what things I'm going to think about and implement whilst this new curriculum is going to be taught and used. So first of all, I just wanted to talk about my perspective, and I just thought it's exciting for me to be a part of this and to see the changes that are taking place from a personal viewpoint, but also importantly, knowing that thousands of children across United Learning schools are going to be involved in this curriculum, learning from this curriculum, is just absolutely amazing news. It will mean, regardless of those pupils' background, pupils from all the United Learning schools will learn more about the contributions of people of colour as we grow towards a greater understanding of well-taught history, science, geography and English units. One of the units that really excites me is one of the units that's been adapted, I should say, that really excites me is the Quest for Knowledge unit. It's a Year 5 unit, and previously this was a unit that focused primarily on the European advancements in science and technology during the Age of Enlightenment. And now it's been modified with more information about knowledge of the world and how this knowledge of the world has been circulated and established throughout history. Some of the themes in the unit focus on the migration of early humans out of Africa, learning about ancient civilizations across the world, and how as humans we've discovered more about the world through the age of exploration. Another unit that stood out in the terms of its adaptation is the curriculum unit, Democracy and Power, which is at the end of the Year 6 curriculum. And it's a really well-placed unit because it's a transition from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. And it involves British involvement in Kenya and in India, and it creates room for pupils to think critically about the role that Britain played during the British Empire. Another fascinating aspect of the unit is the fact that we see Black British people as a group who offered resistance against some of the oppression that they faced. And this is highlighted by the the Bristol boycott in 1963. We are at a time where children are more exposed to African American history. And it's so important that Black British history and the legacy of legislation like the Race Relations Act is taught to children so that they are aware of the monumental leaps and changes that have happened over the last 50 years and even over the last 200 years. Fundamentally, it was a great piece of work that needed to take place, and it was important to recognize that this is a continued work of progress. It will be rolled out, and we need to think about how we continuously modify, adapt, and redraft it, because that's the nature of any working document. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm going to be doing as a deputy head at my school at Whittingham. One thing that we've already established is making sure that our library has been resourced with lots of different books that have been recommended in the core book spine in the English curriculum. They've been stocked and promoted to our children so that all children can actually read books that reflect different experiences. We've ensured, well, not we've ensured, but through the redraft of the curriculum, it has been ensured that subject booklets are provided with any of the units in the history curriculum so that teachers feel more confident about the subject knowledge before they teach that specific unit. They've been written with great attention to detail and they are factual. And we know that sometimes teachers feel a sense of anxiety or trepidation when delivering subject knowledge that they may not feel confident with. So it's really important that in our school, I am working with those teachers who may feel a little bit of not being comfortable because of the content, and making sure that they feel equipped, ready to teach some of these really dynamic but also challenging units. And another thing that we are going to ensure is just generally as members of SOT, ensuring that the quality of provision is taking place. Teachers are well equipped to address any stereotypical misunderstandings that children may have, and making sure that lessons are inspiring and that children are thoroughly enjoying this new change and the new direction that we are moving in. So I just wanted to say thanks that I've been part of this, and I'll hand that back over to John. Thank you very much. Sorry, John, I think you're on mute.
It's great, isn't it? Because I've been doing this for a year, spending almost all day, every day, sitting in meetings, and I still forget to unmute. Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Great. Thank you very much. Right, fantastic. Look, thank you, Christian, very, very much, and also for pointing out I was muted. And thank you to Lucy as well for all of that. And thank you both very much for the part you played in the review that has been done over these last few months. I do think we really do have some very exciting new units. I think we've got some really good adaptations across primary and secondary to existing materials as well. And I think you know, the thing we set out to do was really improve the quality of the curriculum for every child, and I think we've done that, and not only made sure that children are better represented in the curriculum, but also actually given some of the depth and richness to the curriculum that David was talking about. So just next steps really. You can read more about the changes that have been made in the diversity and inclusion section of the hub. There are opportunities for all of you to speak to heads of department who are being briefed, and also to subject advisors. And we have a session for primary in particular on the 10th of June to talk more about what's available and what's changed, and what the materials will be that you can use. And of course, our aim, as with all of our curriculum work, is to just try and make sure you've got great quality resources and materials that you can use, that you can draw down from the curriculum website and make use of in your teaching, adapt in whatever way you think is going to work best for you, and to support you in your teaching, including, as Christian said, a bit with your own confidence and knowledge of some of the things that are new in this curriculum. We do have a follow-up event to last year's Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic leadership session, which is coming in the middle of June, as you can see, and those of you who were at last year's event will be invited again, and that there'll be further invitations going out in the near future. To all of you on this call who contributed to this review, thank you very much, because I know that there are a lot of people involved in doing this work and pulling it together. Thanks for all you've done, and thanks for all you've done throughout this last challenging year of pandemic as well. I hope you found this a useful event, and I hope most of all that you find the new curriculum materials really valuable. Thank you very much for being here this evening and giving up your evening to be part of this event, which I think has been fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed it, and good luck for the rest of the term.